All right, thank you all for joining me today for this webinar on building your fertilizer program. We're going to try and point you in a direction that you can really capitalize on the results for your customers, and in these times of very high price fertilizers and high price products in general, make sure that you can afford to do it and not have to break the bank in the process. So I am your presenter. My name is Rob McCoy. For all of you that have been on webinars with me, I apologize up front that you have to hear my voice again for another probably 45 minutes or so. But if you have been on with me before, I'll try and keep it light and get through it quick. But at the same time, I'll let you know if you have questions, don't hold off on them. Make sure you put them in either the question box or the chat box on your GoToWebinar menu, so that I can circle back around and make sure that everyone gets their questions answered. So we're going to go right into a disclaimer. Some of you may have been on a webinar like this before as well, like specifically about this. We hold this webinar each year, and usually has pretty high attendance because this is one of the more challenging things in doing lawn care, is just trying to figure out what's the solution to the program for the upcoming season. But we have to make some assumptions along the way. We are covering a pretty large area within the United States. So there's not one solution that's just going to work for everyone, but this is really a process of evaluating and thinking through, what's going to give you the right answers moving forward. So we have to assume that there's a normal weather pattern, that we're not going to, have no rain in the spring and then rain through the summer, nothing crazy like that, that the applications are done correctly. We'll talk about soil testing. That'll give you some answers. As I mentioned, there's not specific to your region. I'll use examples that are specific to different regions. And if you have a question that's specific to your region, I don't mind answering that on the webinar. The equipment can cause some variation, especially when you consider if you're using liquids, the spray volume that you're using will affect a lot more than you think it does. And if you get through this and you're like, yeah, I like the idea of how we're thinking through the building a program, but I have a bunch of specific questions for how we're going to build our program, and I just want to know which direction to go with it, then you can schedule a call with me, and I'm happy to help you, or one of our other members of our sales team that's in your area can lend a hand and get you pointed in the right direction. So we're going to keep this pretty simple. We're going to go through what questions we want to ask ourselves to focus on the right things as we go through this evaluation process. And then we go through the process of, all right, how are we going to put this together? What are we evaluating? And then going to actually building the program. So like I said, we keep it simple, but there's a lot of detail in here that you want to make sure that you're focused on. If you miss one aspect of it, that could be where you struggle with an application in the middle of the season, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So some questions that we want to make sure that we address right off the bat. What's your soil telling you? Out of all the applications that you did before, what were the best and worst results? What time of year do you receive the most cancel requests? When do you want referrals, and when's the best time to capitalize on your results to get referrals? And then one overlying factor is, are you trying to grow? Are you trying to sustain? What's your business growth plans? Do you want to grow by 5%, 10%, 100%? That will change your aggressiveness at different times. And when you have to shine in a program, because that's when you're going to be asking every single one of your customers for a referral, and you have to be able to capitalize on not only the investment that you made to making sure that the lawns look at their optimal level at the right time, but also the investment of your office staff and your sales team, so that they're not asking for referrals at a time that they're not likely to get referrals because customers aren't at peak happiness. So soil testing. There's a lot of different soil tests. There's an example of a couple soil tests here. You're always going to see your macros and micros when you're looking at a soil test. I don't go crazy over soil tests, especially in residential lawn care, because it can vary so much, not only from one property to the next, but even from front yard to backyard. You can get very conflicting results. And often that's because of you have different soil activity. So if you don't have a high level of microbial activity in the soil, different nutrients are going to get converted at different rates. So you can look at this, but you're really looking for big trends. You know, does everybody need potassium? Am I short on that? One of the other things that is kind of a second level thinking on this, you know, based on your experience with lawn care, and I see this one a lot. We have phosphorus bans in, I think, 11 of the 50 states. The reason we have phosphorus bans is because the government said, hey, there's plenty of phosphorus in the soil. You don't need to keep adding phosphorus. Well, if you see high phosphorus levels, but you notice that the lawns aren't thick, then it may be that you're not unlocking the phosphorus that's in the soil. So that's a different approach. So it's not just you're looking for the deficiencies in a soil test, but you're comparing what the soil test is telling you to the results that you're actually seeing on the lawns. So if I notice that, you know, it says that there's a ton of nitrogen in the soil, but I'm just not seeing the green up. Well, that could be because the nitrogen's not available. You know, you're not getting any surge growth or anything like that. It just seems like you're putting more on, and you're not getting any better of a result. It could just be getting locked up in the soil. It could be leaching through. It depends on the soil type that you have. So we want to make sure that we're paying attention to that as we're not just taking the soil tests at face value. I would always say we would test 2 to 5% of all of our properties. It depends on how many you have. You know, when I was managing a lawn care company and I owned a lawn care company, in the early years, we could have, you know, 500 to 1,000 customers. In the later years, we were 12, 13,000 customers. 2 to 5% is a lot of soil tests when you get to that amount. But 2 to 5% in the early stages sometimes didn't even seem like enough. So you got to make sure that you just can see some trends and some consistencies there to know, based on the program that you did before, this is the result that we're getting subsurface. And that way you'll be able to compare that with the top surface results that you're seeing and make some adjustments. I always like to make adjustments in the early rounds when it comes to fixing up the soil to make it as productive as possible, just so that you can benefit from it as the year goes along. I wanted to have as much of the soil issues fixed in the spring as I possibly could for 2 reasons. One, the moisture in the spring is typically always better and easier to change the activity level in the soil and the functionality of the soil. So water is a carrier. So if you're trying to get like a humic acid into the soil, because it's going to boost up microbial activity, it's one of the #1 food sources for microbes, then I want to do that in the spring. I don't want to do it in the summer. I want to have the soil and the root system of the turf strengthened up going into the summer so that I'm not dealing with any of the natural stressors that we're going to hit with higher temperatures. So just something to consider, that if you're going to do soil tests, now's a good time to do them. Check the results, make your adjustments early on, and so that you can have an easier season throughout the remaining portion. You're not typically, like, everybody can get a good result in the spring, but that we're only talking about the aesthetic value. If we're talking about the true agronomic value, that's when we can change it and not sacrifice the aesthetics. And your customer base isn't going to know any different. So that's why I would go after it at that point. So another question to ask yourself is, what applications have provided the best or worst results in the past? Full disclaimer, I actually just got off of an hour-long call with a customer of ours, and we were reviewing his program from last year. And I gave him a program last year after a conversation just like the one we just had. And he apologized and said, I didn't stick with it. And when he sent me this new program, he had 24 different products being used in his 8 rounds of applications. That's really hard to keep track of. Overcomplicating a lawn care program is typically the #1 leading indicator to creating problems with a lawn care program. More products is not always better. Diversity of products is not always better. You want to make sure that you have things simple enough and you use high quality products so that you can track the results that you're getting in your program. You don't want to be putting down 4 or 5 things, 6 things every single time you're doing an application, because if it doesn't work, it's pretty hard to figure out what's not working. And is it a combination of active ingredients that don't work well together? Oftentimes you could go to your supplier and they may not even be able to tell you why it's not working well together. They just know when you have a product by itself, this is what it does, this is its mode of action, it works well on its own, but everything's going to react differently in combinations. So with that being said, even though the previous customer I was just talking with, and literally he was going to get on this webinar, I was like, don't get on the webinar, because without using your name, I'm going to bash your program. But he's a good dude, and everybody makes mistakes. But one of his applications in there, and it's ironic that it was the only application where he was putting one thing down and not a combination of different things. He was like, that application worked great. Like, I don't know what I need to do to make that better. I was like, you don't need to make it better. That's the thing. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Stop screwing around with it. You figured out one of your applications. Leave that one alone. I don't care that, and he wasn't using our product. I didn't care that he wasn't using our product. I was happy that he got the result he was looking for. So if it's not broke, don't fix it. But when you're considering bad results, that can be from the application that was just done. It can be from a combination of applications that were done leading up to that point. So you're looking at not only the results when they happen and what applications being done at that time, but what was the previous application and possibly the one even before that, to understand, all right, there's a combination of effects here. Did I lose color? You can't just look at the fertilizer you use for that application. You have to look at the 3 fertilizers that combine to make that source of nitrogen. Because if you have a methylated urea, a trizone, if you have organic materials, if you added biologicals, they're all going to contribute to what nitrogen is actually available to the plant at what time. So you can't just look at the last application. Make sure you're looking at it in groups when you're looking at a good or a bad result. And building your program is a process that never ends. I often joke around like, yeah, we'll build a program. We're not going to end up doing this program by the end of the year. Just because weather patterns change, there's a lot more as far as soil biology that we don't understand, that the products that we're putting down can affect that. Oftentimes there's a domino effect that leads to a result, and people don't realize that they can trace back to that. Like, for example, you get brown patch or dollar spot pressure early in the season. You're like, all right, we got to put down a fungicide. No problem. You put down the fungicide, you cured that problem. And then you can't figure out why you have a problem in the fall getting color, but that's because that fungicide just wiped out half of your microbial population in the soil, and now you have a dysfunctional soil. And dysfunctional is a strong word to use, but if it's not functioning at the optimal level, I would consider it being dysfunctional. So there's a lot of dysfunctional soils out there, but that fungicide that you did in late spring could contribute to the result that you're getting in the early fall, just because there's a lag effect. You could be putting the proper fertilizers down, but never focus on the adverse effect of the fungicide. So you have to be ready to change your program around and understand the consequences of each change that you have to make as you go along. Another point that I like to focus on, that nobody likes to focus on except me, is on cancels. So every month you have to pull a cancel report, and most of the time you're looking at that to just try and plug the holes and make sure that you're saving customers, that you're growing and not shrinking as a business. But you want to make sure that you're adjusting your program, not in major ways, but really analyzing it. Do we have to make a change because of the results that we're getting? If we make a change, will it actually change the results that we're getting, or has that ship sailed? And we have to change it for next year's program. You want to gather as much information as possible, and typically the information that you can get from customers that are canceling, and if you actually have good source coding for your cancel reasons, which is critical. Like, you do not want to be generic with your cancel reasons. Then you can really start to see trends over a longer period of time. Hey, did they cancel because of weeds? That's great that that they canceled because of weeds. Did they cancel because of nutsedge? Did they cancel because of crabgrass? Did they cancel because they got dandelions early, or because you could never kill their ground ivy? Like, that's the stuff that I want to know, because I can make an adjustment to a program then. So you want that information to be specific, and you want it in report form, not based off of the person who yelled the loudest, that you then remember that conversation months later. You want to make sure that you're basing it on the numbers. Hey, we had, just throwing generic numbers out there, we had 50 cancels. 25 of those cancels were because of a weed problem. That's fine. What was the weed problem? Well, I remember Mrs. Smith screaming to me about these wild violets that we told her we were going to get rid of last year. So we got a wild violet problem. No, you have one wild violet problem. Out of the 25 that listed that they were weeds, you could say 16 of them were nutsedge. So you actually need to be more proactive on your nutsedge treatment. But if you didn't have that data, you'd be thinking about who you got screamed at the loudest. So you can have multiple reasons. Make sure that you do a good job tracking with that. Similar to what I was talking about before on the previous slide with the results that you're getting, you can't just look at the one application. You have to look at the previous applications. When you're building your lawn care program, you're actually building multiple programs at one time and overlaying them on each other. And what I mean by that is, there's from a lawn care business perspective, you are managing nutrients, you're managing weed control, you're managing soil, and you're managing budget. So you want to have them all figured out individually and then overlay them with each other. The reason I say that is, if you have a bunch of cancel requests because of weed control issues, you don't have to trace back as far. Yes, you may have an issue with the lawns not being thick enough, and because of that, you're getting more breakthrough on the weeds. You may be able to make a minor adjustment on the type of fertilizer in order to thicken things up ahead of that. But typically, weed controls are going to work fast. If you have an issue with thickness, or you have an issue with color, then you're typically not just getting that result from that application. So you have to trace back. And lastly, not to throw the technicians under the bus, but you want to look at trends based off of location and who's taking care of those properties. can you, did they use a different piece of equipment? Do they have a different method for taking care of the lawns? So that you're not getting a false trend when you're looking at that and trying to make decisions on how you're going to build your program. So totally flipping to a different perspective. We just talked about cancels. Now we're talking about growing your company. I love referrals. Referrals were, for me, the definition of whether we were successful or not. Anybody can pay money and go get customers, but not everybody can get referrals. So if you're trying to target specific times of the year, and remember, we're talking about building a lawn care program. If you're trying to target a specific time of year where you're going to use referrals to grow your business, you better make sure your lawns are on point at that time. So you want to invest in the products at that time that you know are going to perform the best. If you have a bad product, you're just going to be, the people in the office are going to get frustrated. You're going to drop morale down. You're going to have asked for referrals, not gotten them. And that's the trend that I like to call that is you're wasting relationship capital. You do not want to waste relationship capital with your customers. So if you're going to ask them to help you grow your business, and I'm sure that you're going to give them a great discount or an extra service or something like that. But if you're going to ask them, then it can't be a big spend for them. What I mean by that is people that have a great looking lawn may not refer your business because they're not thinking about it. But if you ask them, it's not a big ask. So you make sure that the lawns look good. But in the reverse, if you have lawns that look bad and you're asking for a referral, now it's a big spend for your customer. Now they're not only paying for your service, but they're paying more in relationship capital. And you got to make sure that your timing for asking for referrals times well with your best results within your lawn care program. So if you remember, I said that you have a bunch of programs overlaying each other. If you think about that budget and business part of the program, if you know if that's going to dictate when you're trying to get referrals, then you have to complement it with the agronomic aspect of your program to make sure that you are perfectly on point. Sometimes you know that in your area at different times of the year, it's just a little bit more sketchy. It's hard to get certain results. They're just not as predictable. Well, you're not going to create a business plan where that's when you're asking for referrals. You're going to focus when you know you can get the results so that you can build up that customer base. So when we're actually focused on the process of building the program, you want to go through it in a certain method. You focus on your nutrients first. What are your nutrient needs? That is a separate program in itself. So what fertilizers do you need? You can see some of that on the soil test results. I would prefer to just look at the results that I was getting on the lawns. Now that's not for everybody, but I know based off of turf thickness, strength, color, growth patterns, things like that. That's going to pretty much tell me what nutrients I need. But you also know that I'm going to need a pretty standard amount of nitrogen throughout the year. I want to dabble in some phosphorus and potassium in most areas of the United States. And we had a really rough season with drought, so we may want to build up the potassium just to make sure we can hold a little more moisture in the cells, things like that. But you want to do that nutrient package on its own. Same thing with the weed controls. You go through that and make sure that you are focusing on the weeds that you actually have to control at that point in time. The missing soil components, that could be biology, that could be biological food sources, seasonal pressures. I mentioned disease before, disease, insect activity, application methods. Are you doing all liquids, all granulars? Are you bouncing back and forth? Are you doing the right thing by bouncing back and forth at the right time? And then, of course, your budget. We lay that over the top, make sure that everything fits in. and you may have to budget differently in order to make this all fit. But you also have to tie in the other business aspect of when are you trying to grow and when are you trying to sustain. So when we look at the nutrients, obviously we're going to look at the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, any of the micronutrients. I'm looking at, all right, what's the total amount that I'm trying to accomplish on the season? This is a very generic example. If I was building a program without throwing a sales pitch in here and I was using Bio 800, there's no way the numbers would be this high. But one of the things that is typically a pretty hot topic of conversation when I'm helping people for the first time is the difference between liquid fertilizers and granular fertilizers. And more so now than ever because of raw materials going up, and they seem to have affected granular fertilizers more than they affected liquid fertilizers. But also, with gas prices going up, our shipping's more expensive than ever, and it's way more expensive to ship granular than it is to ship liquid, because you're only shipping the concentrate, and granular, you're shipping the whole product. So something to keep in mind when you're looking at your budget. Can I accomplish with a liquid fertilizer what I think I was accomplishing with a granular? The other thing that I like about liquid fertilizers is if the weather changes mid-application, I can change my cocktail mix. That's what I call it every time. With the mix that I'm going out on the lawns with, I can change that on the fly. I can boost up the nitrogen a little bit. I could bring it down. I can boost up biology. I can adjust anything within that liquid to make it fit the weather pattern a little bit better and be that much more tailored for the consumer. With a granular, whatever the analysis is, if you want to raise the nitrogen, well, you're raising the phosphorus and the potassium too, because you're going to have to put down the whole product heavier. So you don't have the same flexibility. And a really critical point is make sure you're looking at what your nutrient source is. Nitrogen is not just, all nitrogens are not the same. You want to make sure that you understand the difference between, I'll use a simple example, how a methylated urea is going to perform versus a urea with a suppressant, and what benefits that has. What is the percentage that's actually going to get converted and used by the plant. It's not just the amount of fertilizer that you're putting down and how long it's supposed to last. They do work in different ways. And a lot of times when you spend more money on higher end nutrients, you actually are saving money because you're getting such a better predictable result. And over time, you can cut down your rates because you're able to build on that momentum. We obviously don't specialize in fertilizers. So it's not like I'm trying to push it towards getting an expensive fertilizer that we sell. But I'll tell you, if it's a balanced fertilizer, so that the active ingredients in the fertilizer are a more varied source, so it's not all just urea, you're probably going to get a more consistent result. And the only reason I keep stopping to talk is because when I go to click my screen, it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So I apologize for that. On weed control, I've mentioned this before. What are you controlling? Make sure that you're not just blindly putting a weed control down, and don't keep putting a weed control down that you don't need to use. So three-way herbicide is a pretty standard staple of lawn care programs. But if you're done controlling those weeds and you have to switch over to another one, don't just add the next weed control onto the three-way. I've seen that happen a lot. Just completely switch the weed controls. So you make sure that you're paying attention to what you're trying to control at what time of year. If you try and control everything all the time, you're probably going to fail at controlling all the weeds all the time. Project your timing by weeks and months, not applications. So again, liquids are much easier to manage as far as the timing goes and the rates go. Just because you say that with your round 2 you're doing a broadleaf weed control doesn't mean that you shouldn't start in round 1. If the weather warmed up and you have weed activity, you have to start taking care of that then, because for 2 reasons. One, you're only going to get further behind on the weeds and it's going to drive more service calls. But your customer is typically paying you to get a result. They bought into your program because they think it's going to produce a result. But if you have to make a change, you have to make a change. Your ultimate responsibility is to get them the end result that they're looking for, not to follow the letter of the law when it comes to the program that they signed up for. So if you're supposed to be out there doing an application, you got to make sure you're doing the right application, not the exact same application that you sold them on a prepay letter. So give yourself some flexibility, specifically within the weed control timing, that, hey, if it's time to go, then you do it. And if you don't need to do it and it says it's in the application, well, have it available, but you may not be spraying it because the weeds are under control. You want to build in an overlap. So if you need coverage for 10 weeks, but your applications last 6 weeks, then you need to do 12 weeks of applications. So make sure that you are not cutting yourself short, because I would always want to avoid service calls at all costs. And there you go. It's the very next thing. They're super expensive. They not only are expensive to the bottom line, they will affect everyone's morale. People will, and I say people, technicians will stop worrying about doing the best job that they possibly can if they think it doesn't matter. So if the design of the program or the specific application or the timing of your weed control isn't getting adjusted on the fly, then the technicians start to think, well, if I cut a corner, it doesn't really matter because they're probably going to call for a service call anyway. You don't want that to creep into their thinking. You want to make sure that they're always trying to do the best job that they can. So you got to keep that morale high. Avoiding service calls with proper planning is the best way to do it. Full coverage applications usually save you money. Not in all cases, but I would lean towards doing full coverage applications rather than spot treatments. The reason for that is there's a lot of different ways to do spot treatments, but it's often very hard to see immature weeds that haven't breached the top growth of the grass. And if you go out there and spray weeds, but you're only spraying what you see, you're not seeing half the weeds because of the timing of when you're out there. So if you know that you're getting weed pressure at that time of year, it's probably time to do the weed control and do the entire property, because that's what your responsibility is. That way you're going to avoid getting calls 2 weeks later and needing to go out and do a service call and doing twice as many visits as you have to. As I mentioned, liquid weed controls always work better. But again, if you're going back to the full coverage applications, the immature weeds are much easier to take care of than a mature weed. Depends on the type, but that's the typical rule of thumb. Well, if that's the case, I want to make sure I'm taking care of them before I even see them, so that it seems like everything to the customer's perspective is just going exactly the way that it should. Not, oh, I see weeds, now I spray weeds, and you go through that cycle over and over and over and over again throughout the entire season, one season after the next. That is not a good way to build trust with your customer base. Get it under control and keep it under control, but don't be stupid about how much weed control you're using. Just do the application correctly, be thorough with the application, and then at a different time of year, you may have the opportunity to spot treat for weeds. There's always going to be certain things like nutsedge that I mentioned before, where you're going to want to spot treat for that, because it's typically going to be prone in certain areas of the yard and not an entire property. So on the soil components, so you have your soil pH level, where obviously you may need to do a treatment for that you may have to put down lime to keep the soil pH correct. It depends on the overall program that you run. When it comes to doing something like that in soil treatments, I had mentioned earlier on in the webinar that I prefer to get the soil in good shape in the spring, but that is if I've just started with them and I just identified the problem. If you're going to have lime, for example, in a regular application of your program, you do it at the end of the season just to make sure that you have that soil improving over the next coming months while you can't really do anything else on the top surface that's going to improve anything. So that when you get out there in the spring, you have all the advantages in your favor, and you can start producing results. Cation exchange capacity, you know, when we talk about nutrients passing through the soil, this is an important thing to measure because it's a leading indicator for the functionality of the soil. There's a lot of soil tests out there that will give you this information. You may be, if you have a low CEC, you may be microbially deficient. So you want to make sure that, hey, we're getting the right soil life in there, that we're trying to make sure that we have a functional soil food web, and that exchange capacity will improve. Therefore, the use of the fertilizers, even the translocation of the weed controls will improve, and you can get much more predictable results. So some seasonal pressures are always an issue. This is where our flexibility comes into play. So you want to plan for when you're going to get diseases, but it's really hard to take preventative measures without damaging the biological aspects of the soil, without stressing out the turf. You know, in the conversation I just had, and I use this analogy a couple times, and I want to be really clear that, like, I'm sensitive to how this can hit home for people. But if you are using a fungicide, it is the equivalent of a cancer treatment on a person. Would you do chemotherapy if you didn't need to do it? That's the equivalent of using a fungicide on a turf if you don't need it. It is going to have dramatic side effects. You are crushing the soil biology, you're crushing the functionality of that, and you're weakening the resiliency of the turf and giving it no support system. So you better make sure that you have an actual disease problem if you're going to use a fungicide, or that you know that you're going to have a disease problem before you use a fungicide, because it is harsh, and you want to make sure that you are just not throwing them out there because, hey, the customers don't want to see any problems. I got that. But you got to make sure that you explain to the customer, this is why we want to not overdo it. We want to make sure that we're taking care of the turf. You don't take medicine when you don't need medicine. Well, we don't want to give the turf medicine when it doesn't need it, especially medicine that is as strong as a fungicide. The occasional weeds, you know, I talked about nutsedge a few times. We know when it's going to come up. We know it's a pain in the butt. Same thing with crabgrass. You just want to make sure you get it at early stages. You want to make sure that you're scheduling inspections, looking for specific things at specific times of the year. And drought, you know, you have to have an alternative plan in place for multiple reasons. One, the business aspect of it. You have to keep doing applications to stay in business, but you cannot sacrifice the agronomics in order to do so. So do you have alternative applications in place so that you can still be productive in a drought situation where typically a lawn care company is not productive? I'll give you an example. This actually did not come as a recommendation from us. The customer actually just told us they did it after the fact. But in the New England area, this was probably 5 years ago, there was there was a drought situation, and it was a customer that had been using a couple of our products for a while, and they didn't feel comfortable putting down any fertilizers because the drought had gotten so bad. And instead, they just put out our Bio 800 Plus for 2 rounds back to back in the summer because they knew that it was going to be beneficial for the homeowners. They explained to the homeowners, hey, we want to make sure that we're still making progress with your lawn, and there's only so much that we can do, but this is one of the things that we can focus on so that when this drought is over, we bounce right back and don't have any negative effects that are lingering. We can actually be in better shape than when we went into this drought situation. And it worked out fantastic for them. It's not harsh at all. They didn't have to worry about doing an application in the drought, and their lawns actually pulled out of the drought earlier, pulled out of dormancy earlier than all of their competitors' lawns. So make sure that you have an alternative plan there, because you got to stay in business and you have to be responsible agronomically. Make sure that you are considering your application methods. You know, the water volume, I know it's the last bullet point on there, but it's something that I think about all the time. Your spray volume will dictate a lot as far as the penetration of the products that you're using, you know, are the coverage of the products that you're using. You know whether you're supposed to be doing a foliar application or a soil application or both. You know, if you use a low volume sprayer, you're not going to work much into the soil. You're going to need help from sprinkler systems and rain in order to accomplish that. And even the type of sprayers that you have. So I'll give you an example. We could take the same technician previously and have them go out with a Z spray and have them go out with a permagreen. Not bashing permagreens because they have different versatility than the Z spray. But when it comes to weed control, it's just not as good as the Z spray because of the direction of the tips, the spray volume, and you know, on a permagreen, you're spraying out in front with a fan tip that's going horizontal versus a Z spray that's shooting straight down. You don't have as much spray drift, and you have a higher volume spray. You get better coverage. But if you compare a Z spray to a pull hose, you know, on a hose reel, you're going to get much better coverage with a pull hose than you are with a Z spray. You're going to be able to do a higher carrier volume because you're not trying to do low volume spray on everything because of what can fit on the machine. So consider those things, that a low volume spray is actually going to give you less flexibility when it comes to the products that you use. You're going to have to be more exact with your application method versus if you were pulling a hose. Liquid versus granular, we kind of went over this. Liquid's going to give you more flexibility. You can do your applications in a simpler method because you can combine your fertilizers with your weed controls, with your biologicals, versus a granular. I would never use a granular weed control other than a pre-emergent. You know, we've spent extra money and tried to just boost up our broadleaf weed preventatives by doing that. It just doesn't work that great. It's not something that you can count on. So make sure that you're paying attention to what equipment you use so that your program is complementing that. Don't just use any product. Make sure that you have one that's gonna work in low volume spraying if that's what you're doing. If you're in high volume spraying, yeah, you can probably get away with just about any 3-way herbicide that you want as your standard broadleaf weed control because the carrier is going to be better. And then obviously look at what you're pairing with it. All right, so when we're talking about a budget, you want to create your budget ahead of your program. You do not want your program to be influenced. You kind of want to keep things separate so that you don't compare things until you have the ideal of both done. It's not a bad idea if you have the resources to have different people work on different assets. So if you have a business manager, have them work on the budget for the program separately of who's going to do the agronomic responsibilities for the program, and then bring them together and see how good of a fit you have. Make sure that you keep service calls as part of your budget. The reason I say that is if you're going to try and cut corners at any point in the program, just estimate that, hey, we're going to increase service calls. Well, it's about $50 a service call. Just standard flat rate, it's going to cost you $50 for every service call. So if you start including that in your budget, you're like, all right, well, we're going to take that out and we're going to make sure that we're a little bit more proactive on this application, because you're going to spend relationship capital with your customers. You're not going to increase customer loyalty with service calls. You're losing opportunity for building your business with referrals, and referrals are typically the most loyal customers that you're ever going to have. So make sure that when you're comparing that, throw service calls into your budget as that $50 per service call expense, and you're going to realize, well, I can actually afford to do more with my agronomic program if I'm not going to have these service calls. Your cost of goods should be about 20%. I would say after year 2, you should be looking at about 20% COGS. If you are really still getting low amounts of products, it's obviously going to be more costly because you get hit from every different direction. If you're using jugs rather than bulk, if you're getting bags rather than pallets of granular, those prices add up, and then you're trying to stay in that 30% range. But it's just kind of a good measurement when you're setting your price increases for the next year. Hey, am I at that 20% point? Do I need to move it up? Do I need to look at other options for my products that I'm going to be purchasing? Where did I waste the most money? In the products that I used the previous year. So if you have that threshold that you're looking at, then you kind of know I'm either on the right track, I'm ahead of the game, or I need to make some changes. And it's always better to scale back your ideal program than try to balance your agronomics and your budget at the same time. So I told you before, if you have 2 people that can do it, that's great. It's the best way to keep it separated. But even if it's just you doing it, don't do them at the same time, because you'll start making compensations for things here and there, and eventually neither one of those, neither your agronomic program or your budget look the way that you want them to, and you don't realize how that came to be. And it's just because one influences the other, and if it influences the other's decision every single time, it's going to really shift the way that you want that program to look. All right, so as a summary, the first stage that we're going through is investigating. So we're looking at soil, we're looking at the history of the results that we've gotten, what information the cancels have told us, and are we trying to get sales? And how are we trying to get sales? Are we asking for referrals? Once you get past that point and you have that data to work with, then you start building the different components of the program. So you're looking at your nutrients, your weed controls, the missing soil components, different pressures that you're facing, the application methods, and the budget. And then you want to be specific for the order in which you build your agronomic program. Soil first, then nutrients, then weed controls, and then any additional needs. You get a much more predictable result if you go in that order. And you can try it in other orders. I'm not going to fault you for it. Lord knows I've done it in all different orders, but I've settled into this probably over the last decade of just like the best results that I've seen are going in this order. And then once you have that done, balance and adjust for budget. Combine the budget and your agronomic program and see what tweaking you have to do. Sometimes you just hit it out of the park. When you go through this whole process of looking at all this data and going through it in the right order and not just winging it, you'd be surprised at how well you can do on the the balancing of the budget in comparison to the agronomic program. So we'll jump into some questions. If you need help building your program, we have representatives that are happy to help you. You can email me as well. My email address is right there. You can also enter your request in the chat section, and we'll make sure that we follow up on that. That way, that's even easier than sending an email. Or you can just call us at Holganics, 866-56-EARTH. So let's pull up some questions, and if you haven't put any in yet, then you still have time to get them in. Let me look and see what we have here. I gotta expand this view because it apparently hates me. Does granular Holganics work as well as the liquid? It's a little bit different. So on the granular version of Holganics, you cannot fit the standard rate of liquid. So if our standard rate of Bio 800 Plus is 7 ounces per 1,000, you can only fit about 3.5 ounces per 1,000 equivalent on the granular. On top of that, we will not be able to sustain the total family of microbes on a microscopic level on that granular. We keep a pretty good portion of it, but we just don't get the full assortment of all that diversity. And so, long story short, I think that the liquid works better than the granular. And on top of that, it gives you more flexibility because you don't always have to go at that standard rate. All right, what's the next question? I apologize because some of this is hard to see. Excuse me. The next question is, so when you're focusing on referrals, what was the best time that you've seen to get to referrals? I mean, we really focus at 2 times a year. In my past experience, we went spring and fall just because there was less stressors involved as far as weather. Also, the majority of the insect activity was also in the summer for us. So it was just more predictable. The other thing was when we had to think about what we were trying to sell. In the spring, it was easy because the referral was for a full program. In the fall, we did the remaining program plus the aeration and overseeding. So it was actually more valuable to us on what was left on the year to sell the aeration and overseeding and the rest of the program. The other thing was we really liked getting new customers in the fall because we could produce a dramatically different result in a very short amount of time. If you're doing an application of fertilizer and weed control, prepping for an aeration and overseeding, then doing the aeration and overseeding, then following that up with a fertilizer, 5 to 6 weeks after you started, you have a pretty substantial change in how that lawn looks, and it sets a really good tone for that customer trusting you, staying with you, being happy with the results. And new customers often refer at a higher rate than old customers. Old customers get into their habits. So if you can wow a new customer right off the bat, they're excited about your service. It's still fresh in their mind that they just went through the sales process with you. They know who they talk to. If that salesperson contacts them and they got a good result and they ask them for referrals, they're going to probably get some people that would be interested. Let's see, next one. I think we only have one more. Oh, good one. So I've downloaded your Soil Smart program for my area. How does this compare with what you would recommend? So the Soil Smart, and you can actually see a picture of it up on the screen. The Soil Smart programs that we have designed are really, I don't want to use the term generic because they're pretty thorough. But they don't have any comparison to what you've done in the past or the results that you found. And when we went through this, and the whole first half of this webinar was us talking about getting all the data. This is a program without any of the data. This is, hey, if you're completely flying blind and you don't have any of that information and you need to start off, here's a program that you can use, and you're probably going to start off in a pretty good direction. So if you have an established lawn care company, I would not be using the standard Soil Smart program, because you have really valuable data that you should take advantage of. So just keep that in mind, and you have reps here that are happy to help you. And more than likely, the first thing that they're going to ask you is, well, what program have you done in the past? So because they're not trying to recreate the wheel, you have experience in your local area that's extremely beneficial. We're just trying to complement that, do a few little tweaks to help you fit your budget, boost your agronomics, and hopefully reduce your service calls. So with that being said, there's no more questions. If you think of one, then feel free to email me or reach out to any of us, and we're happy to help. And hopefully you can get your program figured out, and I didn't just make you go numb listening to me for an hour. But I hope if I don't speak with you, have a great holiday season, and good luck finishing out the remainder of your applications if you're still out there banging them out every day. So best of luck to you all, and thank you for joining me today. Good luck.